I shuffled out to the curb that Saturday morning in October, holding a thermos of black coffee and wearing the same canvas jacket I'd had since the late 90s. My pickup, a 2008 Silverado with a dented tailgate and a rust patch above the rear wheel, sat where it always sat, behind the chain-link fence at the side of my house in Tulsa. I'd lived in that house for 31 years. The siding needed paint. The gutter on the north side sagged where a branch had taken it down 2 winters ago, and I still hadn't gotten around to fixing it. Most folks driving past would have figured I was a retired electrician scraping by on Social Security and maybe a small pension. That was exactly what I wanted them to figure. My name is August Pendleton. I'm 67 years old, and what nobody in the city of Tulsa knew, not even my own son, was that I was clearing a little over $51,000 a month from a holding company I'd built up quietly over 4 decades. Industrial valves, mostly. Pipeline fittings. Boring stuff that nobody talks about at parties, but the kind of boring stuff that every refinery in Oklahoma and half of Texas had to buy from somebody, and a lot of them bought it from me. I never told my boy. That was a decision I made when his mother passed, back when he was 11. I'd watched my own cousins turn into something ugly when their daddy left them money in the 70s. And I made a promise to Marlene the night before she died that I'd raise our son to know the value of a dollar he'd earned himself. So I drove the same truck. I lived in the same house. I bought my jeans at Walmart and my groceries at Aldi. And I let my son, my Caleb, grow up thinking his old man was just a working stiff who got by. He did good with it, real good. Worked construction summers through high school, paid his own way through Oklahoma State on academic scholarships and student loans, and is now a structural engineer with a firm out of Dallas. He turned 34 this past June, and about 4 months ago he called me with that nervous edge in his voice that fathers learn to recognize. And he told me he'd met somebody, and that he wanted me to meet her family. Her name was Whitley Pendergast Voss. I knew before he even finished her last name what kind of family we were talking about. The Pendergast Voss name was on a wing of the Children's Hospital up in Dallas and on at least 3 buildings at SMU. Old oil money on the Voss side. Banking on the Pendergast side, the kind of family that had a compound rather than a house. The dinner was set for a Saturday in late October at a place called the Mansion on Turtle Creek in Dallas. Caleb called me the Tuesday before to remind me and to ask, very gently, if I'd consider buying a new suit for it. I said, "Son, I've got a suit." He said, "Dad, I know you've got a suit. I'm asking if you'd consider getting a new one." I told him I'd take care of it. I didn't lie to him exactly. I just let him think what he wanted to think. Friday afternoon, I drove out to the Goodwill on 21st Street and picked up a sport coat for $14 that smelled faintly of mothballs and somebody else's cologne. I already had the work boots, scuffed but serviceable, and a pair of khakis that had a small grease stain on the right thigh from changing the oil on the truck back in August. I laid the whole getup out on the spare bed and looked at it for a long while. Then I went into the kitchen and ate a frozen Salisbury steak dinner standing at the counter and watched the sun go down over my neighbor's chain-link fence. Was I being unfair? That question sat with me all evening. I thought about it while I washed my single plate. I thought about it lying in bed staring at the water stain on the ceiling. By the time I fell asleep, I'd settled it. If these were the kind of people who'd judge my boy by his father's shoes, my son needed to know that before he stood in front of a preacher and made any promises. And if they weren't, well, no harm done. We'd all laugh about it later. The drive from Tulsa to Dallas takes about 4.5 hours if you don't speed. And I don't speed. I rolled into the valet lane at the mansion on Turtle Creek a little after 6 o'clock. The young man in the red vest looked at my Silverado like I'd parked a goat in the lobby. But he took the keys and managed to keep most of the judgment off his face. I tipped him a $5 before he drove off. I always tip the valets. They're the ones who actually have to do the work. I walked through those big doors into a lobby that smelled like fresh-cut flowers and money, and I felt every set of eyes in the place skip over me the way eyes skip over a homeless man on a bus stop bench. The hostess at the podium gave me a smile that didn't quite reach the rest of her face and asked if she could help me find someone. I said, "I'm with the Pendergast Voss party." You should have seen her face. It was like I'd told her I was there to read the meter. She walked me back through the dining room with her chin held a little too high, and I trailed behind her in my Goodwill coat and my old boots, and I watched the table come into view from across the room. Caleb saw me first. His eyes went to my coat, then down to my boots, then back up to my face, and I watched something close to a flinch move across his features before he caught it. He stood up. He's a good boy. He walked over and hugged me and said, "Dad, I'm glad you made it." He didn't say anything about the coat. He didn't need to. I could feel his disappointment coming off him like heat off a radiator. The table was a long oval, and there were already 8 people seated around it. Whitley's parents at the far end, her older brother and his wife, Whitley's younger sister, who couldn't have been more than 24, an aunt and uncle on the Voss side, and Whitley herself next to my son, in a dress the color of red wine and earrings that probably cost more than my truck. Whitley's father stood up. He was a tall man, mid-60s, silver hair combed back, wearing a charcoal suit with a tie clasp that caught the light when he moved. He extended his hand toward me with the kind of slow, measuring smile a man gives when he's trying to figure out exactly what's just walked up to his table. "You must be Caleb's father," he said. "Garrison Pendergast Voss, a pleasure." I shook his hand. "August Pendleton." "Please," he said, gesturing to the empty chair. "Sit down. We were just about to order cocktails." I sat. Whitley's mother, a thin woman with the kind of blonde hair that costs a lot of money to look natural, gave me a smile so polite it was almost a slap. Her name was Rosalind. She had on a string of pearls that would have paid off my house twice over. "August," she said. "What a charming name. Is that a family name?" I told her it was my grandfather's name. He'd been a wheat farmer in western Oklahoma. "How wonderful," she said, in the same tone she might have used if I'd told her my grandfather had been a circus clown. "And what is it that you do, August? Caleb hasn't told us much." I caught my son's eye across the table. He looked away. "I worked in industrial supply," I said. "Mostly retired now." "Industrial supply?" Garrison repeated, the way a man repeats a word in a foreign language. "Now, what does that mean exactly?" "Valves, mostly," I said. "Pipe fittings, the kind of stuff that goes between the well and the refinery." There was a small silence. Rosalind took a sip of her water and the ice clinked against her teeth. "Oh," she said, "how interesting. I will tell you that the next 2 hours were the longest 2 hours I have spent in a dining room in my entire adult life." The cocktails came. I ordered a Miller Lite, and the waiter looked at me as if I'd ordered a glass of tap water from the sink. He said they did have several craft selections, and I said a Miller Lite would do me fine, and Garrison's mouth made a small movement that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite a smirk. The menu came. I opened mine and looked at the prices and didn't blink, but Whitley's younger sister, whose name was Bringley, leaned over and said, in a stage whisper she didn't bother to soften, "Dad, are you covering this? I just want to make sure everyone's comfortable. Now you understand what I mean." She didn't say it to her dad. She said it loud enough for everyone at the table to hear, and especially for me to hear. I felt my son stiffen across the table. Garrison waved a hand. "Of course, darling. We're hosting tonight," I said, very quietly. "I can take care of my own dinner." Garrison gave me a smile that was supposed to be generous. "August, please. Tonight is on us, we insist." I let it go. There would be time. The conversation moved on without me, mostly. Garrison talked about a hunting trip he was planning out in Montana. The brother, a sharp-faced man named Sutton who worked at his father's firm, talked about some deal he was working on involving an aging refinery down in Corpus Christi. He said the seller was an old crank from somewhere in Oklahoma who didn't understand the value of what he had and was holding up the deal with unreasonable demands. I sipped my Miller Lite and didn't say a word. I knew that refinery. I knew the old crank, too. We'd had coffee at his kitchen table in Ponca City 3 weeks earlier, and I knew exactly what he wasn't selling and exactly why. Rosalind turned her attention back to me around the time the salads arrived. She asked me where I was staying that night. I told her I had a room at a Hampton Inn out by the airport. She made a small, sympathetic noise. "Oh, August, you should have told us. We have so much space at the house." Although, and here she tilted her head and gave a little laugh, "I suppose the Hampton is more your speed, isn't it? More familiar." I smiled at her. "I do like a hot breakfast in the morning." She laughed like I'd made a joke, but her eyes didn't. It went on like that. Brinley asked me if I'd ever been to Europe. I said no. She asked me if I'd ever been to Newark. I said no. She asked me if I'd ever been to New York. I said no. She asked me where the farthest I'd ever been from Tulsa was, and I told her I'd been to Anchorage once for work. And she said, "Oh, work, of course." Like work was a dirty word. Caleb was getting smaller and smaller in his chair. Whitley wasn't speaking up at all. She had her hand on my son's arm and she was looking at the tablecloth. The entrees came. I'd ordered the chicken because it was the cheapest thing on the menu, and when it arrived, Garrison made a show of it. "August went with the chicken," he announced to the table. "A safe choice. Sometimes the classics are best, aren't they?" I cut a piece of chicken. "It's a good piece of chicken." "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I've always admired men like you. Salt of the earth. You do honest work. You don't have any of the headaches the rest of us carry around. There's a real dignity in it." He raised his wine glass. "To honest work." A few of them raised their glasses. I sat there and looked at him. "That's kind of you to say," I told him. Then Sutton, the brother, leaned forward and asked the question that I think he'd been waiting to ask all night. "Mr. Pendleton," he said, "I'm just curious. Caleb has done so well for himself. Engineering degree, good firm, very impressive. Did you save for his college, or did he have to take loans?" The whole table got quiet. Even the silverware stopped. I looked at my son. He was staring at his plate. His ears were red. "Caleb paid his own way," I said. "Scholarships and loans." Sutton said, nodding slowly like he'd just confirmed a theory. "Well, he's done remarkably well, considering." That was the word he used. I want to tell you what I felt at that moment. Sitting at that table in my $14 coat with my chicken half-eaten in front of me, listening to a man young enough to be my son say my boy had done well considering. I felt the kind of slow, hot anger that I haven't felt in maybe 20 years. I'd raised that boy from the time he was 11 years old. I'd packed his lunches. I'd sat through every parent-teacher conference. I taught him how to change a tire and how to file his own taxes and how to look a man in the eye when he shook his hand. And here was this slick-haired refinery flipper telling the room that my son had done well in spite of me. But I didn't say anything. Not yet. I just kept eating my chicken. That was when the manager came over to the table. He was an older gentleman, maybe my age, in a perfect dark suit and a discreet little earpiece. He bent down near Garrison's shoulder and spoke in a low voice that the rest of us could just barely hear. "Mr. Pendergast Voss," he said, "I'm terribly sorry to disturb you. There seems to be an issue with the card you put down to hold the reservation. Would you mind providing us with a different one?" Garrison's face did something, just for a second. Then he laughed. Of course. Probably just a hold from earlier today. Here." He pulled out his wallet and handed over a different card. The manager nodded and slipped away. Rosalind took a longer sip of her wine. A few minutes passed. The conversation got going again. A little more brittle than before. Then the manager was back, and his face was even more apologetic, and he bent down again. "Sir," he said, "I'm afraid this card has been declined as well. Is there perhaps a third option you'd like to try?" Now you have to understand what was happening here. This was Garrison Pendergast Voss, in the middle of a dining room he probably ate in twice a month, getting told that his American Express had been turned down. In front of his daughter's future husband. In front of his daughter's future father-in-law. The wattage of embarrassment coming off that man could have lit up a small town. He cleared his throat. He pulled out a third card. He handed it over. The manager left again. "Banks," Garrison said to the table, with a smile that looked like it had been clipped on. "I'll be calling them first thing Monday morning, some kind of fraud alert, I'm sure." Sutton was looking at his father with an expression that I would describe as alarm, trying very hard not to look like alarm. The manager returned a third time. He didn't bend down this time. He stood by the table, and his voice was just a little louder. "Sir," he said, "I'm very sorry. None of the cards you've provided are going through. I'd be happy to take a personal check, or we can call a member of your family who might be able to assist." Brindley made a small sound. Rosalind went very still. Whitley's eyes finally came up off the tablecloth. I let the silence sit there for a count of about 5 seconds. Then I reached into the inside pocket of my Goodwill jacket and pulled out my wallet. It's an old wallet. I've had it since 1994. I slid out a black card with no name on the front, just a number embossed along the bottom edge, and I held it up to the manager. "Run mine," I said. The manager looked at the card. Then he looked at me. Something changed in his face. Very slowly, the way a sunrise changes a room. He took the card with both hands. "Of course, sir," he said. Right away, he walked off. I put my wallet back in my pocket. Nobody at the table said anything for what felt like a long time. It was Sutton who broke first. He leaned across his wife and looked at me with new eyes. "What kind of card is that?" he asked. I shrugged. "Just a card." He laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. "No, but really, I haven't seen one of those except in pictures." "Then I guess it's not really any of your business what kind it is." Garrison's face was changing too. The smug had drained out of it. He was looking at me the way a man looks at a snake he didn't realize was in the room. I set my fork down and folded my hands on the edge of the table. "Mr. Pendergast Voss," I said, "since we're talking honest, let me be honest with you. I came tonight in old clothes because I wanted to see what kind of people my son is marrying into. I've got my answer. Now let me give you yours." He didn't move. "You've been trying to buy a refinery in Corpus Christi for about 8 months now. The seller is a friend of mine. His name is Earl Vance. He's 72 years old. He's a widower, and he doesn't trust a single thing about your son's offer. He's been calling me twice a week for the better part of a year, asking what he should do about it." Sutton's mouth opened and closed. "Now here's where it gets interesting for you," I said. 3 weeks ago, I bought Earl Vance's refinery, not the building, the operating company, including the supply contracts that go with it, including the one that runs through your family's brokerage in Houston." Rosen put her wine glass down very carefully. "What you didn't know," I went on, "is that the holding company that bought it is the same holding company that supplies industrial valves and pipe fittings to about 60% of the refineries in this state. It's called Pendleton Holdings. I started it in 1987. I've been the sole owner ever since." Garrison's mouth had gone a particular shade of gray. "Now about those credit cards," I said. "I expect those will start working again by Monday. The freeze isn't permanent. My attorney made some calls this afternoon to a few banks that have business with my company, and a few favors got pulled, and a few accounts got flagged for review. Nothing illegal. Just a reminder. The kind of reminder a man like you might need. I picked up my Miller Lite and finished it. I wasn't going to do any of it, I said. I was going to come here in a nice suit and shake your hand and let you treat my son like a poor cousin, and I was going to let him make his own decisions about what kind of family he wanted to marry into. But then I sat at this table and listened to your son tell this whole room that my boy had done well considering, and I changed my mind. Caleb was staring at me. I couldn't read his face. I turned to him. Son, I said, you've done well, not considering. You've done well, period. You worked for everything you have. I'm sorry I never told you about the rest of it. I made a promise to your mother a long time ago, and I kept it because I thought it would make you a better man. I think it did. But you're a man now. You ought to know who your father is. He blinked. His eyes were wet. I turned back to the head of the table. Mr. Pendergast Voss, I said, thank you for the chicken. It was a good piece of chicken. I'm going to step outside and wait for my truck. My son can decide for himself what he wants to do next. I stood up. I left a $100 bill under my water glass for the waiter because that part wasn't his fault. I walked out through that dining room a little slower than I'd walked in, and I felt those same eyes on me, but they were different eyes now. I didn't look back. The valet brought my truck around. The young man in the red vest looked at me a little differently this time. I tipped him another $5. I was leaning against my tailgate in the cold October air when the front doors opened and my son came out. He was alone. He stood there on the steps for a minute, and then he came down and stood next to me. Dad, he said. Yeah, $51,000 a month, give or take. He let out a long breath that turned to fog in the air. Why didn't you tell me? I looked up at the sky, which you couldn't really see for the city lights, and I thought about what I wanted to say. Your mother, I said, and I made a deal. Before she passed, she wanted me to make sure that you grew up to be the kind of man who didn't need it. And I thought, if I told you, you might not have worked the way you worked, or studied the way you studied, or paid your own way the way you did. I thought it would change who you became. And I wanted you to become exactly who you became. He nodded slowly. He was quiet for a while. Whitley's in there crying, he said. I'm sorry to hear that. Her brother just kept asking everybody if it was a joke. It wasn't a joke. I know. We stood there a while longer. Dad, he said, I want to tell you something. I almost didn't ask Whitley to marry me. I had the ring for 2 months. I kept putting it off. Why? He looked at his shoes. Because of how her family is. I told myself it would be fine. I told myself she's not like them. And she's not, really, when it's just her and me. But every time we'd be around them, I'd feel myself getting smaller. And I'd watch her get smaller too, around them. And I'd think, this isn't who I want to be. But I'd already told her I loved her and I didn't know how to walk away. I didn't say anything. He needed to get it out himself. When she said yes, he said, I called you and I asked you to come down here, and I told myself it was because I wanted you to meet her family. But I think, deep down, I wanted you to come down here and tell me what to do. Son, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I know, he said. You don't have to. He turned around and looked back at the front doors of the mansion on Turtle Creek. I'm going to break it off, he said. You sure? He nodded. I love her. But I can't marry that family. And I can't ask her to walk away from them. So I'm going to walk away first. It's the right thing. I put my hand on his shoulder. He's taller than me now. He has been since he was 16. I'm proud of you, I said. I want you to know that, not because of tonight, because of every day before tonight. He turned and put his arms around me, and we stood there in the parking lot of that fancy hotel for I don't know how long, and my boy cried into my Goodwill coat, and I let him. I drove back to Tulsa that night. He stayed in Dallas a few more days, took care of what he needed to take care of. He moved back home for a couple of months while he sorted himself out, slept in his old bedroom, ate my Salisbury steak dinners with me at the kitchen counter. We had some good talks. He met a woman this past spring. Her name is Hattie. She works as a vet tech in McKinney. She drives a Hyundai Accent with a dent in the passenger door, and the first time she came to my house, she helped me wash the dishes after dinner without being asked. They're getting married in May. I still drive the Silverado. I still buy my jeans at Walmart. The house has the same sagging gutter. But I told Caleb everything, that night in the parking lot and over the months that followed. He runs the day-to-day of Pendleton Holdings now. He's better at it than I ever was. He still works construction on weekends sometimes, just because he likes the feel of it. A few months after the dinner, I heard through the grapevine that the Pendergast Voss family had run into some serious trouble. The Corpus Christi deal had fallen through. Some of their other deals had gone sideways too. Their bank had pulled a line of credit. Garrison was reportedly selling one of their houses. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel anything much about it, honestly. People who build their lives on looking down at other people will find the ground giving way under them sooner or later. I didn't have to push. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm sitting on my back porch with a cup of coffee and the dog at my feet, I think about that long table at the mansion on Turtle Creek and the look on that man's face when the manager came back the third time. And I'll admit, I smile a little, not because of what happened to him, because of my boy. Because my boy walked out of that room as exactly the man his mother and I had hoped he'd be. And that, in the end, was worth more than every dollar I ever made. I've turned that night at the mansion on Turtle Creek over in my head more times than I can count. And the older I get, the more I understand that nothing about it was really an accident. Every piece of it grew straight out of something somebody had planted years before. Garrison didn't wake up one morning and decide to look down on a man in a Goodwill coat. He'd spent 40 years teaching himself that worth could be measured in cufflinks and zip codes, and his son Sutton learned the lesson sitting at the same table I sat at that night. You can't pour poison into a glass for 30 years and then act surprised when somebody drinks it. The cards getting declined wasn't bad luck either. That was a debt coming due, slow and quiet, the way debts always come due in the end. What I want my grandkids to understand when I'm gone and they read this someday is that character is the only thing in this world that compounds reliably. Money can vanish overnight. Health can vanish overnight. Reputation built on the wrong things can vanish overnight. But the way you treat the busboy when nobody's watching, the way you shake an old man's hand at a dinner table, the way you carry yourself when you think there's nothing to gain, that's the part that keeps paying interest your whole life. My Caleb worked construction in the Oklahoma summer heat when he could have asked me for help, and he didn't ask because I'd raised him not to. And when the test came, he passed it without even knowing it was a test, because he'd been practicing the right answer every day since he was a boy. I think a lot about the difference between being humble and being honest. I'm not sure I was entirely honest that night. I wore those old clothes on purpose, and there's a part of me that knows that's a kind of theater. But I'll tell you what I've decided, sitting on my porch these last few months. Honesty isn't only about what you wear or what you say. It's about whether you're willing to find out the truth, even when the truth might cost you something. I wanted to know what my boy was walking into. The cost of finding out was sitting through 2 hours of insults from people who thought they could read my whole life off the soles of my boots. I'd pay it again tomorrow. The other thing I want anybody listening to hear is that walking away takes more strength than fighting back. Caleb could have stayed in that family. He could have spent the next 40 years getting smaller at their dinner tables. He chose the harder road, and the harder road led him to Hattie, who washes dishes in my kitchen without being asked. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a young man standing in a cold parking lot, deciding to start over. I hope you find the courage to start over too whenever you need to. And I hope you raise the people you love to know that the size of a man has nothing at all to do with the size of his truck.